Hi guys, Rod from Think Bensonium here, and this is Rod's Thought for the week. Today I want to consider the importance of a nation's electoral system in terms of how votes are counted. In this thought for the week, I am going to argue that it is critical for the very safety of humanity that electoral votes are tallied in such a way that every vote cast has exactly the same weight in determining the overall election result. I'm going to call such systems non-distortive vote tallying, or NDVT for short. In a two-candidate race, NDVT means there is no possible way that a candidate who receives less votes than their opponent can win the election, even if they lose by only a small number of votes. I shall argue that NDVT is absolutely essential for the well-being of society, and as I have already stated, anything other than NDVT leaves humanity in grave danger. So let me now justify my seemingly extreme statement that the way votes are tallied is critical for the safety of humanity. As many of you will be aware, there are different voting systems in place in different nations, but for today's thought I am going to consider four. The first is proportional representation. This system usually meets the requirements of NDVT because the number of candidates elected to Parliament reflects the number of votes cast. Put simply, if a Parliament consists of 100 members and there are four main parties running for office, then if Party 1 gets 34% of the vote, under proportional representation, that party gets 34 MPs. Likewise, if the other parties get 24%, 19% and 23% of the vote share, then these parties will get 24, 19 and 23 MPs elected to Parliament respectively. A second system, which operates in countries like Australia, is to use a form of preference voting. In this system, if four parties are running for Parliament, it is possible for the voter to rank their preferences for each party. If an individual person votes for a party which fails to get enough votes in the initial count, then that person's second preference is tallied and so on. While this system prevents very minor parties from gaining access to Parliament, it also ensures that major parties don't fail to gain seats because their vote is split across several large parties with similar policies. The third system, which operates in the UK, is first past the post. This system is very primitive in that the candidate that gets the most votes in a particular constituency is elected to Parliament. This system is highly susceptible to gerrymandering. Now, gerrymandering is where you set the electoral boundaries to maximise a certain party getting into power, usually the party that is already ruling, of course. As I said, it is also susceptible to minority candidates winning a seat, and so let me show you why. Obviously, under this system, if Party 1 gets only 30% of the votes, which is a minority, but the remaining 66% of the votes are split three ways, say Party 2 gets 22%, Party 3 31% and Party 4 13%, then Party 1 wins that constituency, even though only 34% of people in that constituency voted for that party. The final and equally flawed system is the American Electoral College. I'm not going to go into detail about how this system operates, but because the votes cast per person is decoupled from the number of votes each state has within the Electoral College, it means, depending on where you live in America, your vote might be worth multiple times someone else's vote who lives in a more populous state. Now, it is a little surprising to me just how relaxed we are that systems where minority candidates can get into power are still allowed to exist. For example, in 2011, the UK had a vote on changing the first past the post system, and the proposal to change the system was rejected incredibly by 67.9% of the population, although sadly only 42% of eligible people bothered to vote. Now, voter apathy is another deep problem that plagues Western democracies. I think the reason most people don't worry about the voting system that operates in their country is they wrongly assume that really dangerous political forces can never get into power because they would only get a tiny minority of people supporting them. Yet both recent and 20th century history teaches us that this assumption is utterly false. The most disturbing recent example we have of a dangerous political force gaining support from a sizable minority is the recent 2020 US election. Despite Trump's horrendous behaviour, he still managed to secure an incredible 46.9% of the popular vote. Now, already at this point, I am making a huge assumption that you, the listener, agree with me about Trump's unsuitability for office. However, if you are a US citizen, then there is at least a 35% chance that you are someone who still supports the former president. Now, it is beyond the scope of this video to argue why Trump is a danger to democracy and the overall well-being of US citizens, but in one very important sense, you, as a Trump-supporting listener, demonstrate my point that no matter how obvious the evidence for a proposition becomes, there will always be a sizable minority of individuals who will continue to oppose the proposition, whether that be a philosophy, a party, or a politician. The following graphic demonstrates the core of my argument. We consider a single proposition, which I call this Proposition A. Proposition A could be determining the truth of a statement, or the suitability of an individual to govern, or even the general validity of a scientific idea. We assume propositions with equal conflicting data, shown as a blue bar in the centre of the red to green line, will have people supporting or dismissing the proposition in roughly equal proportions. In this instance, we would say the idea, proposition, or even person is highly controversial. However, as the amount of data shift either towards the truth of the proposition, or alternatively, its falsehood, we assume that public opinion will correlate with the underlying dataset. This means that at the extremes of the scale, almost everyone will be of the same mindset about the truth or falsehood of the idea or suitability, non-suitability of a person or political party to lead a nation. Yet in reality, it is not like this at all. Even when the dataset is clear enough to convince the majority of people, there will always be a sizable minority of people who will take the opposite view. To start with a really sobering example, let us consider the Nazi regime. Many after World War II created the comforting myth that once the full horrors of the regime were exposed, only a tiny number of Germans continued to support Nazi ideology. Yet sadly, history tells us a different story. While it is true that the majority of Germans rejected the Nazi Party, this did not alter the fact that a sizable minority of individuals continued to support them. This is one reason why so many Nazis were able to escape justice, as they were assisted by many willing accomplices who helped them escape Germany via rat lines to places like Argentina after the war. The historian Alexander Ritchie reminds us that even years after the war, Hitler still registered in some Germans' imagination as a figure of hope. For example, in a 1952 opinion poll, a quarter of West Germans saw Hitler in a favourable light, and 1 in 10 ranked him just beneath Bismarck as one of Germany's greatest statesmen. In the 1980s, Ritchie travelled to Berlin and met people who still referred to those who tried to assassinate Hitler as traitors. What surprised him was the sizable number of elderly individuals who still held varying degrees of sympathy to the Nazi regime. While these folk thankfully did not constitute the majority view, they did constitute a significant minority. As already mentioned, a more recent example is the undying support of President Trump. Likewise, in the UK we see a similar phenomenon with the continued support of Boris Johnson and his brand of the Conservative Party. This support continues despite the fact his government, in their initial handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, ignored its own scientific advice, resulting in the UK entering lockdown too late and coming out too early. These delays led to many more British deaths from COVID-19, especially in the second wave that peaked after Christmas in 2020. Furthermore, the Johnson-led Tory party was found by British courts to have broken the law on several occasions, including proroguing Parliament and illegally using the pandemic to award lucrative contracts to Tory donors. Similarly, the removal of the UK from the EU customs union has been absolutely disastrous for many UK businesses. Despite all these reprehensible actions, Johnson continues to grandstand each week during Prime Minister's questions, refusing to take any of the challenges put before him seriously by giving a straight answer to the questions he is asked. Moving away from politics and thinking about propositions, we see a sizable number of people who engage in conspiracy theories, some more fanciful than others. The real-life consequences of this means that there are large numbers of people who reject the science of vaccination, climate change, or at the most extreme end of this spectrum, that even our planet is round. In conclusion, this is my justification for the argument that non-NDVT systems are dangerous and need to be corrected as soon as possible. While I believe we live in a time where you can usually rely on the majority of people to come to a conclusion about a particular proposition that is at least, well, to a first approximation, ethically sound or reflects the reality of the situation, recent and less recent history demonstrate that this is only a technical majority, in the sense that there will always be a sizable minority of the population who will hold a contrary view, no matter how detached that view is from the data which falsifies it. Therefore, it is critical for the healthy functioning of democracies that minority views can never translate into political power, because in such a situation, it is only a matter of time before a potentially dangerous government comes to power by the votes of a sizable minority and the idiosyncrasies of a non-NDVT voting system. Before I conclude this video, I must point out I have made one very large assumption in my overall argument which requires justification. I stated that we live in a time when we can assume a technical majority will come to the correct conclusion. Firstly, in making this statement, I am assuming the rightness or wrongness of the propositions is obvious and unambiguous. Returning to my diagram, the blue line is either to the far left or right on the for to against, green to red line. Secondly, and more importantly, I am assuming that at the present time a technical majority share an underlying ethical framework which allows them to identify and reject objectively evil political philosophies and the politicians who promote them. Firstly, it is important to note that I've qualified my statement with the words "at the present time," because clearly any anthropologist will point out that in the history of humanity there have been plenty of civilizations with vastly different underlying truth paradigms in operation, especially in relation to ethics. As the atheist protagonist Richard Dawkins recognized in his book The God Delusion, our ethical view is heavily influenced by the society in which we live. Dawkins calls this idea the moral zeitgeist. As I will argue in a future Bensonian thought video, atheism does not allow one to ground their ethical system, so over time the moral zeitgeist can radically change, especially in non-religious societies. However, I contend that there are only two critical ethical axioms that must be maintained as normative to ensure a technical majority of people will make political decisions that prevent really dangerous regimes coming to power. The two critical axioms are: 1, the golden rule, which is do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and 2, all humans, independent of race, gender or creed, are to be considered of equal value. The latter belief does not entail any form of egalitarianism in the form of equality of outcome, but it does mean that a technical majority of people will reject the idea of superior-inferior races. Because in the 21st century, both ethical axioms still largely hold for the majority of the voting population, NDVT voting systems are likely to prevent really dangerous political movements gaining power. While it is still possible for individuals who hold these two ethical axioms to vote for a dangerous political movement because they are seriously misinformed, as long as society in general has access to reliable information sources, there should be enough individuals who correctly assess the political situation to constitute a technical majority, albeit this majority could be very slender. Even if my arguments are too optimistic, at the very least an NDVT voting system is less likely to allow dangerously evil political forces into power. So my original statement that non-NDVT voting systems must be replaced as soon as possible has been justified in this video. Okay, so that's the end of my thought for this week. If you like this video, please do hit the like key below, and if you want to see more of my content, then please do subscribe to this channel by hitting the subscribe button and the bell notification key if you would like to be notified of when I release new videos. I would also love to hear your comments, so please do put them in the chat below. Okay, so until next time, hope your body and mind are in a good place, and bye for now. See ya.